The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents You're Borrowing from My Worldview. So how many times have we heard this? I know this idea of you're borrowing from my worldview has been presented many times in the debates that I've had. Several times, of course, by Cy-Ten Bruggencate. Matt Slick has made similar accusations, but even Jay Lucas has done it when we're just talking about whether or not God exists. So it's not something that's tied specifically to presuppositionalists. It also comes up in questions about morality. And I've been asked many times in email and from patrons supporting this Patreon project, what exactly do they mean when they're talking about borrowing from their worldview? Where does this come from and why? And how should we respond to this? How should we think about this? And so today I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about this accusation that the rest of us, anybody who is a non-believer who wants to make sense of the world or some subject, must be borrowing from usually the Christian worldview. So the first thing to note is that, well, what's a worldview? Well, in simplest terms, worldview is just the label that we put on a collection of ideas. Sometimes it might incorporate everything that you think about a world, all of your experiences, everything that you think is true. But in other cases, we might put it on a specified collection of beliefs. So this is what they're trying to do when they talk about the Christian worldview. In truth, there's no such thing as the Christian worldview. There's over 1,000 different denominations who disagree on every single point of doctrine. So it'd be very difficult to figure out exactly what should or shouldn't be included in the Christian worldview. But if a worldview is our internal model of reality, all the collection of experiences, things that we accept, then really we're just saying that this is what I think. It's not that these specific facts have some significance outside of my head other than I'm convinced that they apply to reality. And if that's the case, I guess we could start by asking, if I am borrowing from your worldview, exactly what's wrong with that? Why would it be wrong to borrow from someone's worldview? Certainly if I have this understanding of the world and you have an understanding of the world, and I find that some element of your understanding is actually correct, I would want to incorporate it in mine. Well, that's not what most of them are actually objecting to. It's true, we share a world as far as we can tell, and we agree on certain aspects of this world. So it's not that they're claiming anything within your worldview is necessarily borrowed from theirs. That's just arrogant posturing. What they're actually talking about is not that you're stealing some portion of the worldview. It's that you're borrowing from their perspective the foundations of their worldview and ignoring all of the implications that they are convinced support the rest of their worldview. So when a Christian tells me that I'm borrowing from their worldview, it doesn't mean that I'm borrowing loaves and fishes or talking snakes. It's really an objection on their part as to why I'm not also agreeing with them about loaves and fishes and talking snakes and various miracles, because we have a situation where there is something that we both experience and understand that doesn't appear to have an explanation. And my position is, I don't know what the explanation is for this. I'm waiting to find out. Maybe it doesn't have an explanation at all. Maybe this is just the fact of the matter. This is the way things are. But they're inside of their worldview, their model of the universe, they have an explanation for this. And their explanation is God, that this is either something God has done, or this is somehow tied up in the very nature of God that serves as the undergirding for the fabric of the universe. And so what they'd like to say, and they frequently say, is that, the materialistic atheistic worldview cannot account for this, but my worldview can, and so you are borrowing from my worldview. Anytime there's any discussion about a foundation or explanation for this. But the truth is, we're not borrowing from their worldview. If my position is, I do not have an explanation for this, and they say, oh, you're borrowing from my worldview, well, that would be an admission that their worldview doesn't have an explanation for it either. So even making this assertion that I'm borrowing from their worldview, or that any of us are, could be viewed as self-defeating right at the face, because my position is I don't know what the explanation is, and if you claim that I'm borrowing from your worldview, then I'm supposing you're saying that you don't know either? In reality, what they're trying to say is, I have the only possible explanation for this. No other worldview can account for this. Only my worldview can offer an explanation. And most of the time, we're talking about one of two things. We're either talking about the foundations of reason, logical argument about how we can know truth or how there can be truth or if there can be truth, or morality. What is the absolute, non-subjective standard foundation for morality? Those are the two topics where this worldview theft is constantly raised. And it's because these are both issues where it doesn't appear that we have any sort of standard that we can appeal to. It doesn't necessarily appear that we have any explanation. And it's very comforting for people who are facing this, but there has to be a reason, to go ahead and accept that God somehow serves as the reason, as the foundation, as the guarantor of reason and morality. But is that the case? And how is it that we're borrowing this? As I pointed out earlier, one of the objections seems to be not that we're borrowing it or that it would be wrong to borrow it. It's that they're convinced that we're borrowing it without acknowledging that we're borrowing it. And it's because they see God as the explanation, and they would view us as individuals who are trying to put forth an explanation. And if you already believe that the only explanation for this is God, then every explanation somebody offers is borrowing from your worldview, but is failing to acknowledge that it's borrowing from your worldview. It's like saying, oh, I have an explanation, it's this. But that's God, is what's happening in their head. Any explanation you offer ultimately has to be tied back to God. But is that the case? So they're essentially making two claims for these unexplained positions. The first claim is that their worldview can offer an explanation for this observation. The second claim is that no other worldview can offer an explanation for this. So we'll take a look at this in two separate parts. The first part being that they can and have offered an explanation for this. The problem here is that they haven't. So when we talk about explanations, we talk about things that have explanatory power. It does us no good to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery or claiming that magic did it. The God hypothesis has no explanatory power, so it doesn't edify us in any way. It doesn't give us additional information. It doesn't actually serve as an explanation. It is just an assertion. And this, by the way, would be true even if we were confident that a God actually existed. We're not. So the claim that they're offering, that God serves as an explanation for this, is one that they haven't demonstrated. Where is the explanation here? Simply saying God did it doesn't solve a thing, even if we were confident that a God existed, because you have to demonstrate this causal connection. And they're stuck in the position of both making a claim that they haven't demonstrated is tied to anything true, and claiming that it is then the explanation for something else without doing any of the work of pointing out how or why this is actually explanatory, that it tells us it's something about anything. Even if God did it or God is the reason happened to be true, that there was a God that served as a foundation for this, we still haven't added anything substantive to the discussion. We haven't, the reason doesn't become more reasonable and morality doesn't become more moral. Our ability to reason doesn't improve. A logical argument, it doesn't begin to be assessed in a completely different way just because we've confirmed what the explanation is. And yet we still haven't confirmed what the explanation is. So two people talking about some sort of unexplained fact or observation within the universe, whether it's about reason or morality or whatever, they agree that here's an observation, and one of them is convinced that God is the reason why that observation can be made, and the other one isn't convinced. What's the difference? The one who believes that a God is the explanation doesn't have any additional information that helps them process the fact any better, any more clearly. They don't have the sort of explanation that helps them understand the observation or fact any more clearly. And if it turns out that they are in fact wrong, their willingness to accept the explanation before there's good reason to think it's correct ultimately hinders them from finding what turns out to be the correct explanation. So how do they prove that their worldview can account for this? Can account for anything? They don't. They don't ever offer an explanation. It is merely a bald assertion. Listen to the debate that I did with Cy ten Bruggencate, and you'll see that not only did he never defend his position that his worldview can explain these things, he doesn't even try, and when challenged on it, he offers all sorts of questions. I asked him, how is it that God can make you certain of something? And his reply was a complete misdirection of, well, that'd be a really good question if you could prove you weren't a brain in a vat. Your question presupposes truth and truth presupposes God. It's just this babbling, repetition of assertions without anything substantive about the question. And there was another point where I asked the reason why God would do something like this, and the whole purpose was to try to find out if we have gained anything that would increase our understanding of the subject by his explanation that God would do it. And his answer was, for reasons which are perfectly sufficient to God. Even if it were true that a God existed, and we don't have any reason to think that's the case, and even if it were true that they were correct that God serves as the foundation for why we can reason or why we have moral views, which they also haven't bothered to demonstrate, this doesn't add anything to the discussion. It is pretty much just a lot of hand-waving and misdirection. It doesn't add anything, it doesn't help us understand anything, and it doesn't change anything. So why are we spending time on it? But not only have they not proved that their worldview can offer an explanation for this, they're simultaneously saying that no other worldview can offer an explanation. Do they bother to try to demonstrate that? So the short answer is no. They didn't demonstrate the first part of their claim that their worldview can't explain it, and they're not going to demonstrate the second one either. What they will do is say, oh, well, if you think your worldview can explain this, please offer us the explanation. And when we point out that our worldview doesn't have an explanation for this currently, they go, aha, so your worldview can't explain it. This was another reason that during the debate with Cy, I asked if the mere fact that something hadn't been proven to be true does not mean that it's false, and something that hasn't been proven false does not mean that it's true. The fact that a worldview doesn't have an explanation doesn't mean that a worldview is inconsistent with an explanation. It doesn't mean that in the future we won't find some explanation. There are lots of things that we can't explain at any given point. It may be the case that there is no explanation for this. There's no explanation beyond, this is just the fact of the matter. This is the way things are. It may be a mistake to look for a why behind everything. But it's also a fallacy to pretend that because someone's current understanding of the universe does not include an explanation for this observation, that their worldview will never have an explanation for an observation, and that no other worldview will ever have an explanation. This is smoke and mirrors. This is, here's one of the great mysteries of life. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because God. See, my worldview can explain it. Yours doesn't have an explanation, so I win, ha ha ha. What is the foundation for morality? Oh, well, that'd be God again. You see, my worldview offers an explanation, yours doesn't, so I win again. Not only that, but yours can't. What do you mean my worldview can't offer an explanation? Well, do you have an explanation? No. So it can't. That's not sound reasoning at all. There's nothing about this position that you must borrow from my worldview that is remotely reasonable. And it is sad and somewhat laughable that a number of presuppositionalists and a number of other apologists have bought into this. They're so confident that they have the answer, that, and they're also confident that they couldn't be wrong, and that there couldn't be another answer, that they just go out and assert, I have the answer, none of you can have the answer within your worldview unless you take it from mine, ha ha ha. Please demonstrate any of that. There's not even really any attempt to ever demonstrate this. It is just an assertion, which makes it pretty much just a statement of opinion. Well, this is what I believe. Well, good for you. Can you tell me why you believe it? And more importantly, can you tell me why somebody else should believe it? And if your only explanation is this nonsensical, I can explain it and you can't, then I'd point out that you haven't demonstrated either of those. And let's start with you actually demonstrating that you have some explanation and you have something more than just magic or God did it or this is my opinion. So when somebody makes this claim in an argument that you're borrowing from their worldview, remember that most of the time what they're actually saying is, the foundations of my worldview offer the one and only correct explanation for this thing that you and I both accept. And that you need to encourage them to demonstrate, first of all, that their worldview does have an explanation and that it doesn't merely have an unfounded assertion. And they need to demonstrate that their worldview is the only one that has an explanation. We've already pointed out that this doesn't actually happen. If it does, there'd be no argument there. Instead of saying you're borrowing from my worldview, you would say, hey, here is the explanation for that fact, and here are the reasons for it, and this is how we can be confident that we have the correct explanation for the fact. There wouldn't be any nana boo-boo, you can't explain this, and I can. There would be an actual explanation. This gets down to our discomfort with the unknown. When we come across something for which we don't have an explanation, we are uncomfortable by this. We can maybe even doubt the foundations of our understanding of reality. But this is a good thing. This recognition that we don't know everything is what drives us to try to find the answers, try to find the correct answers, try to find the answers that are the best supported and most reasonable explanations for what we see. This is the foundation of the driving force behind scientific discovery, behind critical thinking and skepticism, behind an honest exploration of the universe. To merely assert that it's magic may ease your discomfort, but you haven't done anything to demonstrate that it actually is magic, or that magic is even within the bounds of reality. And so you haven't actually offered an explanation. Saying that somebody is then borrowing from your it's magic worldview is silly, especially if they're saying, I don't have an explanation. But it's worse if you're trying to say, you say you don't have an explanation, but you're still accepting this fact. It's like saying, only my worldview can account for lightning. You and I agree that lightning exists, and you say that you don't actually have an explanation for why lightning exists, but my worldview does have an explanation for why lightning exists, and it's a magical Thor-based worldview, and in fact, every time you think about or talk about lightning, you are implicitly borrowing from my magical Thor-based worldview. Well, okay. Someone describe how that is any different from what we hear with regard to other gods beyond Thor when we're trying to explain other unexplained phenomena. We're not borrowing from your worldview, and you look silly pretending otherwise. We're really in a position where we say, here's a list of things within reality that we don't know. We don't have a good understanding for why they are the way they are. And I'm not borrowing from your worldview to get an explanation. Instead, what's happening is you are adding to the reality-based worldview a magical explanation, an assertion that is mere opinion that adds nothing explanatory to the discussion. It adds nothing substantive to the discussion. It is merely there to make you feel better about the fact that you don't actually have an explanation. Because most of the time, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about something and acknowledging that we don't have an explanation. but we're going to keep looking for one. We're going to keep exploring the world until we find the right explanation, while the people who are accusing us of borrowing from their worldview are pretending that they have an explanation without actually demonstrating that they do. And to go the step further of pretending that nobody else could ever possibly have an explanation or any other explanation that doesn't agree with theirs really exposes the flaws in the thinking for this borrow from my worldview position. And the interesting thing to me is, if it were the case that their worldview actually had an explanation, and it actually was the one and only correct explanation, instead of sitting around telling us how we're borrowing from their worldview, why wouldn't they join us in the evidence-based, philosophically sound, rational pursuit of the correct explanation? Because if they're correct, that can only lead us back to the conclusion they already accept. Why wouldn't they be in favor of doing that?
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.